Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the final conference of the TRAFIG project. Nothing is more permanent than the temporary, understanding protracted displacement and people's own response. My name is Elvan Isikazlu. I work at BIC, which has been coordinating the TRAFIG project funded by Horizon 2020 over the last 3 years. And it's so nice to be able to meet in person again and have our final conference like this, but also to have it in a hybrid format. And I'd like to make sure we welcome all of our participants online as well. I don't know where they are, but they're here. What you just watched was an introductory video of the TRAFIG project, which you can find on our website. It paints a picture of the questions that we started out with and what we plan to do. Now, let me paint you a picture of what we've heard from hundreds of displaced people since then. We've heard about many attempts to build a new life that are constantly confronted with hurdles, barriers, dead ends, twists and turns, confusion, disorientation. Often there's only one option to get out of the situation, but there is no clear pathway or guarantee that they will ever get out. Many are living with uncertainty and endless waiting for change. In other words, they're living in a labyrinth of temporary solutions, day after day. What if, instead, displaced people could move freely towards their networks of support? What if they were enabled to move towards the people they choose? What if they were supported in widening their connections to people and encouraged to use multiple pathways out of this labyrinth to start a new life? Well, then, forced displacement, and not the solutions to it, would be temporary. The permanence of temporary solutions that we see today could disappear. This is our vision. After 3 years of the TRAFIG project, it has only become clear to us. What displaced people need to thrive, not just to survive, but to thrive in situations of displacement is not tied to any one state or any one place. It's tied to people. This vision will become more concrete over the course of today, so I'd like to dive right in with our introductory panel of my TRAFIG colleagues. And I want to start with the why. Why did we create this project, and why should anyone care about its results? To answer these questions, I happily turn to my colleague and scientific coordinator of the TRAFIG project, Dr. Benjamin Etzold. Benjamin.
Good morning, everybody, also from my side. Just hang on, technical issues. Okay, well, why did we do this? Why should we care? Let me start answering this question by telling you the story of Tekest, a 30-year-old Eritrean refugee who our Ethiopian research team met in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. In Eritrea, Tekest was forced to join the army as he completed grade 11 in school. He was 17 years back then. After a few months of military training, he tried to run away, but was caught and spent 5 years in an Eritrean prison. In 2012, he managed to escape from prison and fled to Ethiopia, where he first lived in Adi Harush camp in the Tigray region. A few months later, he arrived in Addis Ababa, where he was eligible for urban assistance program for medical reasons. For 7 years, he has been applying for resettlement. He tries to move on to the USA or Canada, countries where his relatives lives. He occasionally gets support from his cousins, but struggles to get by on a daily basis. Tekest considered that more than 1/3 of his life had been unproductive, a time he had been waiting to transit to a more productive life. This is just a short story from our research, but when we applied for this project, we were very well aware that millions of displaced people across the world are in a similar situation. At the time when we applied in 2018, the European Union, politicians, policymakers in EU member states, they were still grappling with what they called then the migration and refugee crisis. But we always need to consider that displacement is a global phenomenon. The number of people caught in conditions of displacement has not only grown due to persisting violent conflict and persecution in many parts of the world, but also because states and the international community have failed to provide durable solutions for displaced people. And as you can see on this chart, the number of people who could not return to their place of origin, who do not have access to resettlement, who have not become locally integrated, has been steadily growing since 2005. And last year, a durable solution has been found not even for 1% of all refugees globally. The solutions gap has increased dramatically in recent years, and so has the number of people who have been living in such long-term displacement situations. At the end of 2020, it was estimated that around 15.7 million refugees, that's 3/4 of all refugees, have been living under protracted displacement. There are conditions that are very precarious. And these people, they are hindered in fulfilling their potential. And as Elvan just pointed out, they have entered a labyrinth and now trying to find a way out. So why do we care? I think we must care. And the 12 research partners from 11 countries who together applied for this project, they did care. And when starting this project, our ambition was first to contribute to an enhanced understanding of this protracted displacement as a social phenomenon, and then to contribute to developing alternative solutions that are better tailored to the needs and capacities of displaced people themselves. We wanted to point out different pathways through and out of this labyrinth.
Okay, thanks, Benjamin, for the why, but you're not done yet. We need to move on to the how. How did TRAFIG approach the problem of protracted displacement? How was the TRAFIG project different than other approaches so far?
I think first, sort of that the number of people who have been experiencing protracted displacement grew so rapidly because there has been a lack of political will from many sides of states to actually change this. There's a misconception of how these durable solutions can be brought about. Often we're talking about top-down solutions, and displaced people are administered at certain places by states and humanitarian actors, for instance, refugee camps, and then certain, but only very limited pathways are offered by states through this labyrinth. But in our understanding, sort of, it is displaced people's own needs and priorities that are largely ignored. In their own potentials, they remain limited. People do develop their own solutions, and they prefer having multiple options at hand to move ahead in life. They rely on others in doing so, and yet they are constantly confronted with legal barriers and other hurdles that keep them in a precarious situation. In our understanding, thus, we have a more sustainable approach is people-based, where displaced people's social networks are used as resources to build secure futures across different places. And in addition, we also see mobility as a source, as a potential of people, also for overcoming protracted displacement. States often impede this mobility. When we started, we had developed a hypothesis for our project, saying that the more connected and the more mobile refugees are, the less likely it is that they end up in a situation of protracted displacement. And conversely, we believe that the less connected and the more immobilized displaced people are, the greater is the risk that they're vulnerable, dependent, and living in limbo. And we will hear also across the day whether this maybe too simple hypothesis holds true or not.
Okay, thank you. On to the what. What did the consortium do to learn what it is that we know now? And what methods did TRAFIG use? You can explain a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, we had 3.5 years or 3 years of research time in a sense. We did multi-sited study in 11 countries in total. There were countries of reception, transit, and asylum and settlement. In Africa, we studied experiences of Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia, of Congolese and Burundian refugees in Tanzania, mainly in Dar es Salaam, but also included internally displaced people who fled within Congo to the city of Bukavu. In Asia, we studied conditions and coping strategies of Afghan migrants and refugees in Pakistan and Syrian refugees in Jordan. And there, of course, one of the ideas was also to compare a long-standing protracted displacement situation with a situation that emerged quite recently. By including European countries, we wanted to point to the fact that, protracted displacement as a phenomenon also is not only a phenomenon limited to the global south, but such enduring and hard to resolve crises, they also exist in countries of the global north. And thus we did research in Italy and Greece. In addition, we expanded research to Germany to also investigate how refugees have found a pathway out of displacement. Overall, we engaged with more than 3,000 participants in our study through qualitative interviews, group discussions. We did a quantitative survey, and of course, common key and expert interviews.
Great, thank you. We see that the phenomenon of protracted displacement and the goal of ending it is nothing new. It's in fact at the center of diverse institutional frameworks and interventions across the world. But still, fundamental gaps of protection remain. Why is this the case? How has the search for solutions evolved over the years? For this, I'd like to turn to my colleague, Dr. Albert Kraler from Danube University.
Thank you very much, and also good morning from my side to participants in the room and online. Indeed, the goal of providing solutions to displacement has been a central piece, in a way, of the global refugee regime since it's emerged in its first form, very rudimentary forms in the interwar period after the First World War. But I want to turn first to the more recent history of the concept, whose main point really also was to renew and initiate a discussion on solutions. So protracted displacement, when it was framed by UNHCR in 2004 in a policy paper, the intention was to describe the situation of people who did not find a solution. Initially, the discussion focused and UNHCR focused very much on refugees, so did not include internally displaced persons and other people, asylum seekers, irregular migrants that we also included eventually in our analysis. And it defines protected refugee situations as a situation of a long-lasting and intractable state of limbo, where refugees' lives may not be at risk, but where basic rights and essential economic, social, and psychological needs remain unfulfilled after years in exile. As I said, later the concept was also in the discussion, also in policy extended to other groups, notably internally displaced persons. And what it emphasizes, and this has been mentioned already a couple of times, is that people remain in precarious situations for prolonged periods of time, despite of protection frameworks, despite of humanitarian aid provided. And they remain so after prolonged times after becoming displaced. They do not find a durable solution to their situation and have limited capacities and opportunities to rebuild their lives. And that's really the main point of solutions, durable solutions, namely the ability to rebuild one's life. And this is multidimensional, so both protected displacement and the solutions that are related to it that should lead out of protected displacement are multidimensional. They have to do with economic precarity, marginalization, rightlessness, and uncertainty, which has been mentioned. But also, as Benjamin has pointed out, with immobilization, that people are stuck in certain place and cannot move on. Now, in TRAFIG, we use this multidimensional concept of protected displacement and understood protected displacement as being shaped by three forces. Displacing forces hindering people from returning, marginalizing forces that prevent real local integration, and immobilizing forces that block people's mobility and chances to seek a future elsewhere. Now, the debate that was reinvigorated really by the 2004 policy paper by UNHCR actually goes back a bit longer to the late 1970s, when it became clear that in the context of poor countries of the global south, that host countries had increasingly limited capacities to confront and accommodate the growing numbers of refugees that were dependent on long-term humanitarian aid, and that were unable to become self-sufficient, and instead, as I said, dependent on external aid. So initially, that debate was very much centered on states and attempts to increase humanitarian aid. But it was also at this time that the notion of durable solution emerged. What is interesting here, I think, is that durable solution is something that is not, that you cannot find in the Geneva Convention. It's not a word that's mentioned there. It's not included in UNHCR statutes. It's a policy concept, and like protected displacement, it has emerged to describe what is the underlying and ultimate goal of the refugee protection framework, namely to enable people to rebuild their lives, displaced people to rebuild their lives, and to provide perspectives. So what it really does, the term, is that it highlights that protection from persecution and violence, which is of course crucially important and is at the heart of refugee protection, it's not enough. The conventional solutions that are discussed, return, resettlement, local integration, in turn, they only point to pathways to how durable solutions can be achieved, but they should not be confused with durable solutions in themselves. And that the same holds true for a new solution that has become discussed in the recent years, complementary pathways, which doesn't mean that people necessarily achieve the ability to rebuild their lives after being transferred or having access to such a solution, and that is really important. Now, what the emergence of the two terms really does signal also is they came in at a time when it became increasingly apparent that a decreasing share of refugees had access to durable solutions. So they would point at a problem. And what they do is what these terms try to do is to put back the solution orientation back on their agenda. Now, you also mentioned, Elvin, in your question that how this search for solutions has evolved. And in a way, one can say, actually, it has been at the center of the global refugee system from its very, very start. Going back to the 1920s, when a first High Commissioner for Refugees was installed, Fridtjof Nansen under the League of Nations, that was really about trying to find pathways out of destitution that many of these refugees, at the time only Russian refugees, that were affected by the Soviet Revolution in Russia, to provide them means to find livelihoods and so on forth. It was also not a state initiative, but it was an initiative that came from voluntary agencies dealing with caring for those refugees. And one of the main instruments that was adopted then was a refugee passport. It was nicknamed the Nansen passport after Fridtjof Nansen. And that was really meant as equipping refugees with the means to be mobile, to find employment where employment is. And it was later also supplemented by a program by the ILO to transfer and to help find employment of refugees in Latin America and elsewhere. Now, the Geneva Refugee Convention meant a further step in thinking about durable solutions, even though, as I said, it didn't use this language, namely by defining a certain number of rights that refugees should be afforded to, like access to employment or education, and reflecting a wider human rights term after the Second World War. The idea really was here that rights could be a means, a basis to find a solution. Now, to be realistic and sadly, a rights-based approach unfortunately remained out of scope for many of the displaced, globally displaced, especially in the global south, where even in those countries that have signed the Geneva Convention, some core rights, for example, access to employment, or mobility rights, internal mobility rights are not granted. And certain key states like Jordan and Pakistan have not signed the Geneva Refugee Convention at all. And it's precisely in this context in which renewed debates on solutions have emerged. And the Global Compact on Refugees is another more recent attempt to put the solutions back on the agenda. Now, in Europe, the securitization of migration and asylum since the late 1980s and has meant that even though a nice legal framework has been set up, a common European asylum system, has meant that this secularization at the same time has undermined protection and paradoxically also contributed to protected displacement by prioritizing states' interests to control migration over providing solutions for those displaced. Shifting the attention back again to solutions must be a key priority, therefore. And a recent example is the activation of the very quick and fast activation of the temporary protection directive for Ukrainians. This was really about providing immediate solutions to those displaced from Ukraine. And importantly, in combination with their freedom of movement or visa freedom that they had under the visa liberalization program. And that meant that that Ukrainians have a free choice, which is of where to go and how to connect to the networks, which is very different from many other refugee categories who are stuck and have to find their way through the maze, the labyrinth that Alban talked about.
Thanks, Albert. I'll pass that along. You've alluded to several things that I want to pick up on. First, to another way it can be done, but returning back to the fact that multiple policies and legal frameworks already exist, but that first, the securitization of these frameworks hasn't helped, and that is just not enough. And I want to turn now to Dr. Laura Morasanu from the University of Sussex to elaborate more on the governance regimes. Laura, in your work package, you found, in fact, that many current laws and even protection instruments can make things worse, essentially creating the situations they're trying to prevent. How do displaced people cope and navigate through these regimes?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Elvan, and good morning to everyone. So this was one of the key questions that we explored, how displaced people navigate governance regimes, so how they access protection and support, how they make use of the policies and programs available. And before answering or providing some insight into this question, let me just elaborate a bit on the problems and limitations with governance regimes, because we found that these contribute substantially to deepening and prolonging people's vulnerability. So there are three aspects that we wanted to highlight here as part of our key findings. First of all, protection and support systems in place are often quite limited or fragmented. There are, of course, differences between regions, also depending on other factors. But overall, the research showed that formal support is pretty patchy. And this is also to do with states' limited capacities or limited interest in aligning their responses to regional or global protection frameworks. These are rarely binding, and therefore there are few, if any, sanctions that come with non-implementation. Second, where protection and support are available, they tend to apply quite unevenly depending on displaced people's legal status or whether they are formally registered, where they live, if they are based in camps or not, which practically means that many displaced people fall through the cracks, for instance, internally displaced people. And third, regulations are extremely complex. They're quite difficult to navigate, even for people who are specialists in this field. A good example here is the many protection statuses available. Displaced people find it often quite difficult to navigate these systems, to understand the different statuses, why they are granted a particular status, what rights are associated with them. And regulations also change very quickly and very frequently. So it's difficult even for specialists to keep up with new developments. So in this context of multiple obstacles, it's not surprising that most displaced people are quite far from reaching a durable solution. So if we look at our survey data, the picture that emerges is quite concerning on many counts. Many respondents were displaced for many years, on average 11 years. Many also found themselves in very precarious positions. For example, holding temporary residence status. This was very common, even dominant in countries like Italy or Greece. And this insecure legal status, we found, was one of the most significant factors that contributed to displaced people's marginalization. And it came with a very high risk of remaining in a protected situation. In terms of support, we also saw in the survey that few had access to legal advice in the past year, less than a quarter, which is quite concerning if we consider the complexity of the regulations, the changing nature of regulations that I mentioned earlier. Also, we saw in the survey that less than half benefited from any kind of formal support in the past year, so be it from the government or international organizations or local NGOs. There are, of course, considerable differences between countries, or depending on whether one was based in camps or camp-like arrangements or outside. And this was actually one of the main cleavages across different contexts. So those who lived in camps had much better access to support, shelter, healthcare, cash assistance, also legal advice, language training, and so on. But we should bear in mind that living in camps comes with significant drawbacks. So even though people might be better placed to access support if they are based in camps, there are significant challenges that come with living in camps, including dehumanizing, poor conditions, surveillance, all sorts of restrictions. So it's not surprising that many choose to actually live outside camps, even if this means relinquishing formal support. And this brings us to our next concern. So the problems and gaps that governance regimes present more often than not limit people's opportunities, But this doesn't mean that displaced people don't develop strategies to cope. They do. And our qualitative research showed, for example, that displaced people are often, for example, forced to identify ways to fit in with restrictive regulations. Just to give you an example, they might resort to intentional family separation. Families sometimes take this very difficult decision to separate, planning to apply for family reunion later. We had a participant from Syria, for instance, who arranged for his son to be transferred irregularly to Germany, later to the Netherlands, so that the father can then apply for family reunion to join him there. And this was a very risky strategy, a very painful strategy, but for this family, it seemed to be the only way to be able to build a secure future. There are other ways to cope as well. For example, people might cope with restrictive regulations by combining lawful and what could be termed lawful, unlawful strategies. We observed that there is a lot of mobility back and forth, but so people who live in camps might move back and forth in order to be able to retain support available in camps, or they might remain formally registered in camps, but actually live outside in order to avoid being excluded from asylum procedures. And third, some are forced to circumvent regulations altogether. For example, they might decide not to register. We had cases where refugees who arrived in Italy avoided registration and avoided having, for instance, their fingerprints taken because they realized that might prevent them from moving onwards to a destination, to their preferred destination, for instance, where they had family or where they saw they might have better work opportunities. But it's also worth mentioning here that displaced people don't just develop strategies to cope with restrictive and complex regulations, but also with waiting and with the uncertainty that surrounds this. So displaced people's well-being is heavily impacted not just by the trauma of displacement, but also what comes afterwards. So the fact that their lives are put on hold, they have to wait for an interview, they wait for their asylum claim to be decided, they wait to be reunited with their families, and some develop creative strategies to regain control over their time, over their lives. For instance, engaging in volunteering or language training or various leisure activities. But on the whole, we found that this is very difficult, first without specialized support, and then without significant material, emotional, and social resources. And I think Benjamin will talk more about the social aspect.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much, Laura, for this. You mentioned how people cope. I have two more questions before we can turn to questions from the audience. I would like to ask Benjamin exactly this question. What gives people hope in such situations? What are the resources they draw upon to get by and move ahead?
Yeah, I mean, we saw that the hope lies in people's connections, in other people, actually. Laura explained how people are trying to navigate very complex, difficult to understand governance regimes, how people are coping with uncertainty and insecurity on a daily basis. And we see they are not alone in doing so. Their experience of displacement is shaped by and through one's own social relations. It's particularly the people's families, the neighbors, friends they have, employers, business partners, or ethnic communities people are embedded in. And this was one of the focal points of our research. So we ask ourselves always, well, what role do networks actually play for people in such precarious circumstances? And we looked at it at three different levels of understanding, sort of first locally at the places of living, translocally, so where it's also considered the connections people have within the respective country of living, and then transnationally across several countries. I think in the upcoming panels, we will hear more on this local aspect and a translocal aspect, and I would just like to share a few insights from this transnational dimension. Well, first, we need to note that people's social relations, they are inevitably transnationalized once people are forced to leave their homes and cross an international border. While they're still continuing, of course, to maintain social relations to others who remained at the place where they fled from, or with others who already departed long ago. A survey we conducted shows the different spatial extent of displaced persons' own networks. Overall, 42% of the people we interviewed in long-term situations, they maintain connection with people living in other countries. But we also saw that there's a big difference between the different countries. In Congo, for instance, it was only 10% of the interviewed people there who maintained transnational contacts. In Ethiopia, it was about 1/3, and only 3% mentioned, for instance, that they have still maintain contact with others in Eritrea. In Italy, where we interviewed a lot of West African migrants, but also coming from Pakistan, for instance, here it showed that 82% are transnationally connected. On the one hand to their home countries, but also to third states. One key finding of our research is that people who are living in refugee camps, can you click on somehow? Okay, thank you. One key finding is that people who are living in camps are less likely to be embedded in transnational networks, or maybe the other way around, it's difficult to establish a causal relation there. Those who have transnational networks are not stuck in camps in a sense. We produced a number of network maps that give you an impression of the degree of international connectedness and the diversity of displaced people's global networks. For instance, 38% of Eritreans we spoke to maintain contacts to persons that are important to them in another country. On the map, you see that besides contact to Eritrea, USA, Germany, Canada, Sweden, Australia, there's also contacts to Israel or the Gulf states, for instance. What role do such networks play? Tekest, who I introduced you in the beginning, he stated, for instance, the following. When we arrived in Adi Harish camp in Ethiopia, we were 4. Each of us paid $1,500 for a smuggler up to the Ethiopian border. One had a US visa. He left in less than 2 months. One had a brother in Germany, and he left through Libya shortly. The other one had a sister in Sweden and left through Libya as well. I was the only one who had no close relative abroad. However, thanks to God, I also have cousins in Sudan, Canada, and in the US who support my survival and pay for my kids' school fees. Among the Afghan refugees interviewed in Pakistan, a much smaller share, also only 10%, had family members in another country. But still, you see also on this map that wide-ranging global networks of Afghans. Of course, with a displacement situation going back more than 40 years, there's also transnational relations that have very long history. You see close connections between Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran, of course, but also to Europe, most notably to Greece, Turkey, Germany, but of course also to Australia or North America. A widowed Afghan woman we interviewed in Islamabad stated, I have 4 brothers and 2 sisters. My younger brother and I live in Pakistan with our families. The rest of my siblings moved from Pakistan to Canada about 19 years ago. My 4 uncles and aunts also live in Canada. I'm in regular contact with them. My brothers help me financially. Sometimes they send money every month, sometimes not. My immigration to Canada was rejected, even though my brother told the authorities he would bear all the expenses for me and my family, but it didn't work. So besides these anecdotes, we found comprehensive evidence that information and emotional support across a distance are crucial resources for protractedly displaced people. We saw that 20% of the displaced people we interviewed in the survey, they regularly receive remittances from family members. And these remittances, they help to pay for costs of living, education, health crisis, and of course, particularly important in times of emergencies, in times of crisis. These remittances, they also support business endeavors. They can help to kick off own entrepreneurship. Despite their fundamental importance, it seems, however, that displaced persons' transnational networks are overlooked in protection strategies and in humanitarian aid for both IDPs and refugees, which are largely locally oriented. In some cases, we also noted if refugees would openly show that they get support, for instance, from a family member living in another country, that this would jeopardize their access to support they get from the authorities in a camp, for instance. The quote also indicates that relatives, of course, they facilitate onward migration, either by enabling family unification, humanitarian admission, labor mobility, but also by financing irregular journeys. And yet there's ample evidence in our research that displaced people are heavily constrained in maintaining their transnational connections and using this, well, network capital for onward mobility to other states. More often than not, it is clear sort of that existing border, visa, and asylum regimes, they narrow down rather than widen up the refugees' future perspectives and do not allow them to benefit from the resources in the wider transnational network. And we consider this as a waste of potential that actually prevents too many displaced people from overcoming precarious conditions. So one of the key takeaways from our study is that keeping people connected, both sort of locally at the place where they're living, translocally within the respective country, but also internationally across borders, that this can actually unlock opportunities for displaced people. The other way, you could frame it the other way around, networks might be able to show you a path out of the labyrinth of displacement.
I like this image, and I think this is exactly the paradigm shift that we're talking about when we say people-based approach. We're talking about moving away from seeing individuals as single entities, but rather as interdependent into people, connections, and these translocal, transnational networks of support that we can actually make use of. We don't have too much time, but we have a very special guest on our panel. This is Anila Noor from the Global Refugee-Led Network. And I'd like to ask Anila about what she's just heard on this panel so far, about our approach, and whether what we're talking about resonates with your experience.
Thank you. Thank you for TRAFIG for inviting me and giving me this opportunity, and congratulations to all the team to putting this amazing report. Being representative of these communities you are talking about, I think when I heard you started with this quote for one person, I wasted my 13 years of life. But I think we as a refugee say, this system wasted my life. That's what we are trying to do. We are reflecting our experience to highlight the gaps. And I think this report will help us a lot in highlighting not only the gaps, but also make accountability, because so many, since 1952, so many countries who have more population of refugees or displacement, like Jordan and Pakistan, you refer, they are not binding, and they're just seeking out a way out, to create more vulnerabilities in the communities. And I am from Pakistan, and I witnessed Afghan refugee, but when I was Pakistani, we never realized the difficulties they are facing. We are blaming them. Okay, they are here to take away our jobs, and it's happening similar in Congo, in South Africa, when people are internally displaced. But being myself, when I turned a refugee in Europe, I found how much it's changed. And then you understand, but how we can use this lived experience to bring these voices to the policies. And this is the gap, unfortunately. I'm so happy when you mentioned about, right now, 15.7 million refugees are displaced, but how many have the access to even express? That is missing. And I think this TRAFIG report is amazing, which I'm gonna use a lot when we're gonna have a global compact of refugees in June. They are happening. And this consultation are way to show this kind of reports, how we can highlight why refugee convention was not helping, and how we can create more a durable solution, but how we can even define these durable solution as from whom, and who has the power to implement, who has the power to even to understand. And I also, while you were all speaking, I was taking few notes. It's like, who has the right even to have these rights? For us as a community representative, we are working globally, and we saw that regardless you are in Kampala, regardless you are in Bangladesh or in Europe, this system is very much focused in their own understanding of solution, their own understanding of integration, their own understanding of resettlement. And complementary pathways is not happening in Europe. It's some kind of entitlement which is still happening in Canada and in US. So how we can learn and bring this solution to here, but also give these voices, this power, this solution to the people, which is supposed to help them. But unfortunately, because of systematic barrier, these people, we people, I will say we people are facing more challenges. We are becoming more victim of the traffic, especially women, children, elderly people, people with the disabilities, the gender, the LGBTI communities. They are so much hidden. We are not touch upon those problems. You mentioned about a woman who are stuck in Pakistan, and she are facing being a woman. Why she was not get asylum or this solution? But when we are thinking about this solution, we think we're talking about only men who are looking for a job. We never think they are human beings. We never think what happened to their families. These are beyond our thinking, how we are putting into the same narratives, and how we need to change this narrative. Last night when I came to Brussels from Netherlands, and I saw two people voluntarily standing to taking the Ukraine flag, I was so touched. So I said, this is the moment we want to show globally. When I'm taking off to the train and I saw someone is holding my country's flag, how will I feel at home? That's the narrative. That's the welcoming response we need to put in global compact of solution. And that's my last sentence or recommendation. And thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you, Anila. I'd like to turn to the audience now and give you an opportunity to ask our panelists any questions. Also can be comments about what you've heard so far. I'd like to start taking questions from the audience here, and then in the meantime, we can collect some questions on the chat online so the online participants can join as well. So the floor is open. You have a mic to send around. Questions? You have a question? Yes, please. Would maybe wait for the mic so everyone can hear you. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Patrick from Congo. The question would be very curious question. What's the difference between different countries where the research has been done? Did you find some differences? What are they? One or two? Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more to collect? If not,
my question is like this. I don't want just to go back to figures and numbers and research. That's kind of your feelings, guys, your hunch. Back to square one. Do we really want those people to move? Why should we help them to move in the first place? Is there a way that we can help them and stay in their place? Is it the thing that we really have convictions in? Do we believe that we should give those people some hope to move? And at the same place, they do not. And we can't help them. Thank you. Any
others to take before? Okay, then First question, Benjamin, you want to take with the country difference?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. It's a big question, the differences. And so we'll soon publish, I mean, sort of you will first have a glimpse on this in our traffic policy handbook that we're happily releasing today, sort of where some of these differences are marked. The key difference we find is, I think, the question sort of how respective reception regimes work, sort of how displaced people are recognized and categorized in respective countries, and particularly what rights go with these. And I think this is the basis also for developing an own solution, for developing one's own pathway, as a question on which kind of legal basis you can do that. The legal entitlements you have that. For instance, are you granted access to work? Are you able to move freely within the country or move on to another country? Do you have access based on your protection category to family unification or not? I think some of the legal entitlements are a fundamental basis. And we clearly see large differences according to that. Of course, we see large differences that relate to different cultures, that relate to different histories of the respective places. For instance, Jordan and Syria, sort of the region where we did the research in northern Jordan, there are long-standing international relations between, of course, southern Syria and northern Jordan. So the displacement situation doesn't start at point zero. There's a long history in the relations between people, and people can build off that. And of course, we see that very different contexts. And these histories, they also need to be taken into account. For further differences, I would point to the next two panels that we have: the global panel, and then the panel in Europe as well.
Second question, who wants on the panel to take a stab at the question, why should people move? Why not to keep them in place?
Yeah, maybe I can add a few words. So I think the research showed that people do move a lot, locally, regionally, nationally, transnationally. So it's probably better to support them within those kind of endeavors. Yeah, because this is what emerges in a bottom-up way. So they value mobility as well. And this seemed to be quite important for sustaining lives and building secure futures.
Maybe if I can just add to that, but of course it's not an either or. And I think strengthening also just people's choice is also about creating opportunities locally, removing marginalization and legal barriers, providing rights that people can also, if I want to stay for various reasons or need to stay because they have family commitments and so on and so forth, or are otherwise limited in their mobility is important for them. So I think that's of course, if you're talking about now complementary pathways as a fourth durable solution, and now we have three solutions that focus on mobility in some sort of a way. It's not the mobility that counts. It's really the do people have people the ability to rebuild their life, wherever that might be.
I like to add one point. Migration, or people on the move, was happening from the centuries, is a part of our history, mankind history. But unfortunately, since 2015, it's become like a new crisis. So I think we need to work together to make it normalized, because climate change is happening, and we don't know what happens. I'm coming from Netherlands, and I always say Netherlands is on the threat of the climate change, and maybe we all are moving to Afghanistan. So you never know who will become refugee. It's just like we need to work together to make it normalized. Why still we are discussing this, and why we are not letting policies to understand it's human right to move, and it's happening. So to create more understanding instead of who has the right to move and how they even have access to those rights. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Due to time, questions from online.
Yes, we do have a couple questions online. I'll ask them all at once in the interest of time. So the first question for the panel is to ask you whether you can discuss the current different standards and situations regarding responses to refugee protection. So the example is given of open arms and open doors in many European countries for Ukrainian refugees, but at the same time pushbacks against other refugees from Africa and the Middle East. The second question is for Anila. As you mentioned in the beginning of your intervention, that you're representing your community. And so the question is how you work to guarantee that you represent the community in all of its complexity. And then the last question is about IDPs and whether you know of any institutional frameworks to support self-resettled IDPs. For instance, localization of conventions that mandate state and city governments to reduce their vulnerabilities. Thank you.
Thanks, Caitlin. Benjamin, first question.
Okay, it should be working now. Yeah, thanks to the online audience. Hope people are listening attentively. Yeah, of course, I think the current situation with 12 million people or so who have been displaced in and from the war in Ukraine. Yeah, also questions, I would put it like this, questions the approaches that have been taken over the years towards refugee protection and protection of IDPs. We clearly see that different standards are emerging, or that people are treated differently, that rights are maybe assigned even arbitrarily to different groups of people. I think as Albert mentioned in his point, I think one crucial difference is whether people have a perspective and will have a right to stay from the beginning, or whether systems are constructed in a way to deter people and to prevent them from staying and sort of taking away the opportunities. I think it's difficult to prevent displacement as such and to demolish like all the root causes of displacements, of forced migration. But I think the least what we can do is offer people hope, offer people opportunities, show them pathways out of their precarious situation. And I think this is the biggest concern I also have, that these different standards that we're currently seeing in terms of like displacement, people coming from African countries, coming from the Middle East, versus people coming from Ukraine, so that these will be remaining. Whereas I would think sort of these aspects like what we see with the Temporary Protection Directive or so, this offers new avenues and new perspectives that should be opened up for all displaced people.
Anila, do you want to take the next question?
Yes, this is a big question, and I will say this is a question always come to us. As soon as we share, we are talking about our representation of our community, people ask this question, who's making you legitimize, to represent? But I will say again one more question. That's why we are representing our community. Do we have asked UNHCR or UN agency why they are representing refugees or why they are working with refugees? So it's a big question, even I don't know. But I will say our lived experience is our knowledge and our voice is our power, and which is very limited. I can't even claim like I'm representing 15.7 million. No, I can't. But how we are getting this access to this kind of platform is giving us power to speak, to represent, and we are making sure when we are there to talking about refugees representation are there. That's why we have this slogan, nothing about us without us, because we are demanding for a systematic access, participation, where we can come represent our voices, and these voices need to be represented those people who are facing the barriers. So it's complex, and our representation is very limited, and to have this access, we are trying to be representative as much as we can, but I can't claim I'm representing 15.7 million, but still we are trying to be. If I say today, I would like to know how many refugees are here or online, I would like to know, because that's we face, like wherever we go, we are ticking the box and we are trying not to, feel exploitation, and we are trying to highlight the gaps and the reason why we are there, because we like to be involved in the policy debate and the solution. Thank you.
Thank you. 2 minutes. Anyone can answer the IDP question that was asked relatively quickly. The next panel to take it up because they don't have enough to do. That's right, they have plenty of time. I appreciate the question, and perhaps we might have to take it up. Perhaps it comes out naturally in the next panel.
Yeah, and maybe I can just say a few words on standards. There's one example of a convention, the Kampala Convention, that has been adopted in, when was it? Help me, Caroline, in 2006 or thereabout. And that defines obligations of states vis-a-vis internally displaced persons. But that has been unique. So in other countries, that's not existing in the same way, but there is a broad policy debate, which actually also becomes increasingly important in the context of environmental disasters. And even, it's not a problem over there sometime in the future, but it's a problem now. Whereas, for example, debates in Germany following the last year's floods about the adequateness of responses and how people had access to relief. So it's really a broader question. And on the international level, there is also this interagency standing committee that's a coordinating body between different UN bodies that has worked a lot since in the past 15, 20 years on defining standards on how to provide support to internally displaced, but also what these rights, what the quality of the what the rights are basically that internally displaced people should be afforded to, and when a displacement situation can be considered really as being resolved. Very often, we also know that about, for example, people who have been affected by the Hurricane Katrina in the US. There are still people there who are living in temporary housing and didn't really have a chance to rebuild their lives. And that's these. Of course, these are not legal binding standards, but they are reference frameworks to look.
I want to thank our panelists very much and your audience for your attention, your questions. We now have a short coffee break, where I encourage you to take a look at our publications, which are at the back of the room. Our recently launched policy handbook is also there. Please take a look. We'll be making reference to it today. We will also be publishing a synthesis report with all our findings and a toolkit for practitioners that will be coming out next month. So stay tuned for those two. And we will reconvene at 11. Thank you.